Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today as part of the Child Protection in Emergencies and Cash Task Force. We are thrilled to have our guest speaker, Paul, joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca, from CPC Learning Network to get us started and introduce today's presentation and discussion.
Thank you for that introduction, Angela. We're excited for this webinar today on the recently released report, Monitoring Child Protection Within Humanitarian Cash Programs. So the primary author of the report, Paul Harvey, will be joining us today to present, and he will be doing a short presentation on his research for this report on child protection within humanitarian cash programs, followed by a Q&A. Paul has worked for years in humanitarian relief as a country representative, emergency coordinator, and program manager. He also has nearly 20 years of research, evaluation, and policy experience as a researcher at ODI and IDS, and as an independent consultant. He is currently a partner at Humanitarian Outcomes, focused on humanitarian action. His recent work includes a report for UNHCR on cash and protection, and the sectoral outcomes of multi-purpose cash, a high-level panel on humanitarian cash transfers, an evaluation of the Dutch humanitarian action, evaluations of the cash response to famine in Somalia, and WFP's and ECHO's approach to livelihoods and studies for ALNAP on the state of the humanitarian system. So as you can see, very extensive cash experience. The report that Paul is about to present on summarizes findings from an initial scoping study, which seeks to review how child protection outcomes are captured when monitoring multi-purpose humanitarian cash programs. The study intends to inform the development and piloting of a new approach to integrating child protection concerns into multi-purpose cash monitoring frameworks. The study is managed by the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Actions, Cash Transfer and Child Protection Task Force, as well as the Assessment, Measurement, and Evaluation AME Working Group. Now over to you, Paul.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be joining you. Talking to you from Brighton in the UK, where it's definitely holiday season, so I promised to get my kids to the beach. So I'll be reasonably brief and leave as much time for Q&A as we can. And thank you for joining at I know what's a tricky time of year. The introduction of me was fairly comprehensive. The Alliance for Child Protection, Cash Transfer and Child Protection Task Force, which is quite a mouthful, commissioned this study primarily because I wanted to contribute to the embassy outcome indicator process being agreed under the Grand Bargain work stream that's sort of ongoing. And this was very much designed as a scoping study that would lead to more in-depth work and piloting. And so the challenge here is primarily that sort of multi-purpose cash is hard to monitor because of its breadth, because it has possible outcomes across a whole range of sectors and protection. Figuring out what you're going to monitor and how you're going to monitor is hard, and any monitoring tool risks becoming too unwieldy, and any process of a monitoring tool risk being a nightmare because everyone's trying to get what they want included in a monitoring tool. And that's kind of what the Grand Bargain work stream was struggling with. It started by sort of having its opinion amongst all the sectors and protection about what should be included, and ended up with a mess that they then had to sort of narrow down. So I was conscious in sort of starting to think about this of the need for discipline narrowness in thinking about what it would be sensible to ask multi-purpose cash monitoring systems to think about in relation to child protection. What this involved was 15 days of work time. So this is very much an initial scoping study. This is not a massive in-depth piece of work. It reviewed the literature. It carried out 25 interviews. Those interviews focused partly on particular contexts on Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and Somalia to try and find out how those big, large-scale multi-purpose cash programs were monitoring child protection at the moment. So one of the caveats is the 15 days. One of the caveats is that I'm not a child protection expert. Those caveats aside, it was, I think, a useful, interesting piece of work, and hopefully we've come up with some ideas about the way forward. Theory of change is perhaps an overgrand title, but in trying to sort of frame this, I started thinking about, what is it that we're trying to monitor here, and can we sort of divide it into broad categories? One is the possible positive impact of cash on child protection outcomes. The examples are there. Is cash helping to prevent negative coping strategies such as child labour, early marriages, contributing to mental health by mitigating stress on households? And that might or might not be happening. It's something that you want to monitor and to understand. And so that's clearly a monitoring sort of set of categories. Then there's a sort of a set of process questions around the interlinkages between cash and child protection. And these are primarily, I think, about referral pathways. So as a implementer of multi-purpose cash, you'd be concerned with whether there are clear referral pathways and whether the people doing the monitoring multi-purpose cash are using those referral pathways. Are child protection risks being identified? Is children at risk being referred appropriately? Are the right links, interlinkages being made between cash and child protection programming? And then the third category is around sort of risks of cash and possible safeguarding risks. And I've given some examples there, risks of children being left alone if people have to travel to get their cash. You might create incentives to split households if separated children are one of the targeting criteria. And so you can imagine the way in which cash is targeted creating child protection risks, and you'd want to monitor to see whether or not that's happening. So those are the broad areas of concern that we were sort of looking at in this study in terms of how those things are currently being monitored in existing contexts. So as I said, we looked at Turkey, Jordan, Somalia, and Lebanon, and looked as, you know, in the context of 15 days to do all of this and write it, meant doing a few interviews per country and reviewing the sort of existing project documentation around multi-purpose cash in those countries. So the example there is from Jordan, and this is the actual question in the post-distribution monitoring that's currently going on, and the percentages of what the most recent 2018 found of people receiving cash, the percentages of households against two of the categories. Not dissimilar to the other context. So where issues of child protection were addressed in current monitoring systems was in questions linked to coping strategy indexes or livelihood coping strategy indexes. And it asked questions around child labor, around school attendance, and sometimes around early marriage. And Jordan is sort of more comprehensive and more comprehensively reported than some of the others. The level of detail on child labor was variable. And often this is one question in a long module and is sort of wrapped up in a sort of a composite coping strategies index. So the extent to which it's disaggregated is limited. Often on this, it's sort of bundled in an index approach. There's limited monitoring of the risks of cash that I was talking about, the sort of category around, is cash creating child protection risks. But in the Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, what there was strong referral systems, in part because these are refugee contexts with HCR as a lead, with a strong sort of protection mandate. And so these are slightly unusual contexts. And they're also, over the last some years, been unusually well-resourced contexts. So the sort of levels and resources that have gone into monitoring are probably greater than in some other places. And certainly in Somalia, it was harder for some of the systems to be established, partly because of the sort of absence of child protection actors in some parts of the country, partly because of greater challenges around access. And so Somalia is an example of where some of these issues are harder to monitor. What was interesting and unusual, again, about Jordan and Lebanon is you do have there what I call population level monitoring or population level analysis. So unusually there are systems to do vulnerability analysis of the whole population of concern. And child protection issues are addressed in that in terms of things like child labor and early marriage. That's really valuable because you can look at people who are receiving cash, but also people who aren't receiving cash and make comparisons between them. And that's surprisingly rare. There's also, of course, post-distribution monitoring going on specifically for recipients of cash, of child protection appearing in those post-distribution monitoring systems. And as I was just talking about, there are referral systems, some of them stronger than others, depending on the context. Looking at moving forward, these 4 bullets are kind of the areas we started thinking about. So tweaking monitoring. So bearing in mind the need for discipline narrowness, clearly recommending what you need to do is add 24 questions about child protection to a multi-purpose cash post-distribution monitoring system isn't going to be very helpful because that's unlikely to be agreed given the need for discipline narrowness. So part of what you need to be doing is thinking in a disciplined sense about whether there are ways in which you could sort of tweak existing questions, add 1 or 2 questions to enable child protection concerns to be more strongly monitored without overburdening instruments. The other way of thinking about it is to add a sort of complementary child protection module which is able to go into more depth on child protection issues and which is asked to a subset of the population or less frequently so that it doesn't overwhelm regular monitoring systems, but enables occasional more in-depth examination of child protection issues. Then there are questions about sort of who's being asked the questions. So partly this is about, the tendency of post-distribution monitoring systems to ask questions of the head of the household, and that whether that's adequate when you have child protection concerns and you want to monitor child protection issues, whether or not it's possible to ask questions of children and what, ethical and sort of practical issues that would arise from that, and whether it's possible to ask questions of sort of different people within the household. And there are questions about that. And then also questions about, as I say, this sort of, are you just monitoring people who are receiving cash and asking what are the child protection impacts of the receipt of cash? Or are you interested in child protection risks of people who are receiving cash and who aren't receiving cash and making comparisons between them? And then there's a set of issues around the skills of monitors, particularly in relation to child protection. Are people trained to deal with sensitive issues? Are they trained to recognize red flags in terms of child protection? Are they trained on referral pathways? And with the same set of issues, if you're seeing multi-purpose cash is concerned with both protection and across a range of sectors, then training relatively low-skilled monitors to be child protection experts and gender-based violence experts, and you can imagine a whole range of things that we're concerned about when people receive multi-purpose cash, and expecting monitors to be across all of them would be challenging. And there's an interesting example in the report of some World Vision research that was particularly around child labour in Lebanon, where they recruited trained social workers with backgrounds in psychology and early childhood education to conduct interviews. And interestingly, they found much higher rates of child labour in that survey than they found in the VASIR survey, the Vulnerability Assessment Framework for all of Syria, and attributed that to trained social workers directly interviewing children, leading to greater willingness to talk about issues, and so high rates of child labour have been found in that survey. So there's clearly issues around what you're likely to find according to sort of different levels of skills and capacities of people asking the questions and who they're asking them to. So in terms of looking forward, it's also clearly obviously important to think about what else is going on and how whatever comes out of this piece of work can link to other bits of work. And primarily this, as I said, was intended to inform the Grand Bargain multipurpose cash outcome indicator process. And in that process, they were sort of agreeing a framework in June. They put a sort of placeholder under child protection for this research and the follow-on research to be concluded. So for at the moment, there's a sort of a placeholder waiting for this process to add some suggested indicators into it. Also ongoing is the Child Protection Needs Identification Analysis Framework, which is intended to support countries to identify and analyse child protection needs, to look at how those issues can be mainstreamed in assessments, and is rolling out across a number of pilot countries. And clearly, there's some interlinkages in what we're talking about and what that process is doing. So perhaps scope to look, as we think about piloting, with linking more closely with the NEAF process. And then interestingly, the Women's Refugee Commission, Mercy Corps and ISC last year developed a toolkit for cash and gender-based violence that I think provides and had a sort of modular approach. So what I was just talking about in relation to the possibilities for child protection, they've done for gender-based violence. They have a gender-based violence module that can be used to monitor GBV issues within multipurpose cash programs. And so it certainly makes sense to learn from that. If we're thinking about developing a child protection module, it might make sense to think about merging them, given the sort of interlinkages and coexistence between violence against women and violence against children. If protection and all the sectors decide what's needed is a module that looks in more depth at the particular sectoral issues or particular protection issues, then you don't overburden the post-distribution monitoring system, but you overburden everyone else with an endless series of modules. And so you need to be careful not to do that. So in terms of next steps, let's put it there. So interestingly, in doing the interviews with some of the places that I did the interviews with, Jordan and to an extent Turkey and Lebanon, when I was talking to people implementing multipurpose cash programs about their views on whether or not they needed any additional input or guidance on how to address child protection issues, the answer was pretty much no, we're doing it fine, go away. There wasn't a great perceived need for more help. But maybe all we need to do is sort of document existing brilliant practice in those places and to share that more widely so that the brilliant work they're doing can be understood and developed in other contexts. They aren't completely right, and it could be sort of more critically evaluated, and there are ways in which child protection issues could be addressed. But either way, I don't know on the basis of 3 or 4 interviews, so there's a need to better document or evaluate emerging good practice. Somalia was more open to piloting, and so to the extent that the next step is piloting a sort of module or a tweaking of existing PDM systems in a particular context, Somalia seemed like a good place to do it, and through the Somalia Cash Consortium. And then, of course, we didn't really look in depth at other places. So, there's all sorts of other places where multipurpose cash is being implemented, where it would be possible to further document how child protection issues are being addressed. And I'm sure there are interesting issues emerging from those places. There are opportunities to cast the geographic net more widely and to go into more depth in the places that we looked at in this scoping study. This is a sort of broader issue than child protection, but if you're concerned with child protection risks amongst people in a humanitarian crisis, then you want to be monitoring people who are receiving cash, but also people who aren't, and making comparisons between the child protection risks faced by people who are receiving assistance and who aren't. And you might be most concerned with the people who aren't receiving assistance. So monitoring at the population level, not just cash recipients, makes sense for all sorts of reasons. There's lots of scope, I think, to tweak existing systems without sort of overburdening existing PDM systems to make them slightly better at addressing child protection issues. In the process of sort of registration and profiling households, there's lots of scope to better capture issues around age of children within the household, gender, disability, early marriage. There's scope within questions around coping strategies and livelihood coping strategies and coping strategies indexes, get slightly more nuance around child labour. So not just what percentage of households report some form of child labour, but some idea of types of work, injuries, worse forms of child labour, and some scope to address concerns around separation of children and the questions around that. The scope, I think, to add a question around sort of well-being, conflict, and mental health to try and get at issues around whether or not cash is worsening or contributing to better mental health within households and what that means in relation to risk for children. I think the scope for monitoring better sort of protection processes, so things like number of referrals and our referral systems working well, which at the moment don't often appear in PDM systems. There's certainly scope to develop a more in-depth child protection module along the lines of the gender-based violence module, or possibly combined with it. It would be good in standard post-completion monitoring to slightly better address the sort of category around risks that receipt of cash is creating child protection risks. So the other thing that this scoping study was meant to do was inform the outcome indicators for child protection. Now, in trying to say something sensible about this, I was very, very, very conscious of not being a child protection expert, but I thought better to have something that people can argue about than have nothing at all. So this was sort of my suggestion of what might be possible, but that needs sort of expert review and ideally piloting and more in-depth work going forward. But it seemed to me that with either existing questions or a small tweak to existing, you could monitor these things, and that would be a useful set of child protection outcome indicators that could be monitored within multi-purpose cash context. And then, so wrapping up in terms of next steps, and this is partly handing over to other people because the next steps don't involve me, but what I suggested the next steps would be look at the practicality of developing a module, to pilot that module, and also to pilot scope for existing questions along the lines that the report suggests. That's it from me. Questions, comments, thoughts are obviously all welcome.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation. And now we're going into the QA part of this. So if folks have questions, you could either drop them in the chat and I can read them, or you can ask directly.
So I'm looking at the last slide here, which also includes an indicator which says change in percentage of separated children and households looking after separated children. I would like to hear more about that, because one of the approaches, of course, is to avoid as much as possible that incentives are the reason for families to care for children.
Just run that one again. The third one, changes in percentage of separated children, households looking after separated children. This wouldn't be a sort of objective of multipurpose cash. You wouldn't be hoping that multipurpose cash would necessarily lead to less separation or more separation. It's a risk that you're concerned about. So as you just described, that there are worries that cash might create perverse incentives around separation. And to the extent that that's a real risk, you'd want to monitor whether or not it's happening. And so, it would be possible within post-distribution monitoring questions to ask questions around separation within a coping strategies index type approach, and that would enable you to monitor that. But I mean, if you think monitoring is going to create those risks, if you see what I mean, then you wouldn't want to.
I was wondering if during the research inquiry you came across questions regarding children as direct recipients of cash support, because this is an area that we are also kind of talking a lot about. I think there is very little information on that. Thinking more about unaccompanied children nearing or transitioning to adulthood in a short time frame, living independently, whether or not cash support to...
Yeah, no, it's a short answer. It's a good question, but it didn't come up. The existing monitoring systems didn't seem to be picking up issues around unaccompanied and separated children very well. But again, I'm back to the sketchiness of we're able to do it in 15 days. So I wouldn't swear to any of it.
I wanted to build on Cliff's question and just link it to the separated children. We're exploring the option. We're currently exploring doing some research around kind of handing cash directly to unaccompanied children. And one of the things that's coming up is that often they are actually, as part of best practices, they're actually placed in family-based care. And so while they're unaccompanied children themselves, they are actually in a family-based care. So it would be really interesting to explore, and I don't know whether this came up through the desk research, whether the separated children are actually unaccompanied children that were placed in foster families. What was the type of care that these children were actually in? And were the families that were looking after separated children, were they receiving more cash because they had taken in a separated child or not? What were some of those dynamics which would have played into the capacity of these families to look after these children appropriately beyond the children that they were already looking after?
These are all really good questions that I don't have any answers to. I was tasked to look at large-scale multipurpose cash programs and the extent to which child protection issues were being monitored within those, rather than cash programs with specific child protection objectives. So I suspect what you're talking about, there might be some interesting learning and information about in sort of small-scale cash programs with specific child protection objectives, such as supporting unaccompanied and separated children. In the big programs like ESSN and the multipurpose cash to refugees in Jordan and Lebanon, I didn't find out very much about these issues, which doesn't mean that, of course, there aren't child protection actors in those contexts dealing with those issues. There's some interesting thinking about this, and Hannah Thompson and people, so there's some interesting learning that's gone on over the years in relation to it.
Touch on your question around the GBV and cash module that was produced and you sort of cited as a possible approach or something that could be built upon. In your discussions, did you get a sense of how well known that was? Was it being used? Did it not come up at all? And I know the limitations of the review were able to do.
So no, it didn't come up, but then you wouldn't necessarily expect it to because it's pretty new. I mean, it was sort of piloted last year. And so I guess it did come up when I was talking to Somalia people, because that's how I found out about it. I did think that it looked sensible and useful and well written and what they'd produced was interesting and did seem like a possible way forward, with the caveats of needing to think about how it relates to everything else and the demands that are being made on implementers. Keeping any process sort of manageable and sensible is obviously what's needed, and hence the need to think quite carefully about not going from trying to overburden post-distribution monitoring to try and overburden people with a infinite number of modules.
Yes, and who the user is, kind of touching on your capacity point.
Yeah. Yeah. So there'd definitely be an art to designing something that was sort of light enough to be helpful.
And I just wanted to pose a question talking about the next phase of this multi-purpose cash research. So if you and your organizations have or use any post-distribution monitoring PDM tools, indicators or systems for MPC that address child protection concerns, especially outside child labor and early marriage? And if you do, if you could please share them, we would appreciate it for the next phase going forward.
And of course, also feel free to reach out to Rebecca and I and Vanessa as the co-chairs of the task force if we can facilitate linking you to others, or we will continue to be very invested in this process and with our colleagues in the AME task force. So it's a living exercise very much underway, and we are so pleased with the engagement of the task force members.
Wanted to mention, as Paul said, that this is one of a multi-phase process of doing the child protection and cash module. So the next phase will be documenting what is going on in the country, some of the countries that Paul mentioned. So right now, the current plan is to focus on Jordan with a desk review comparison to Lebanon, and then there will be a piloted module with these indicators or others that the folks who are doing the next phases will implement. All right, Paul, any final words?
Huge thanks for the time to present this to you. Good luck with the work as it goes forward. Do sort of stay in touch if I can be helpful in any way, and have a great day, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul, and everyone who joined in.
Bye all.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.